Good afternoon to those who are on the East Coast, and good morning to those who are on the West Coast or somewhere in between. And because this is a global experience, good day to all of you. I am Marshall Mitchell, and I am the host and moderator for today's fantastic 4th Annual Lonaé A Memorial Lectureship and Forum. The title is It Begins with Each of Us, Fostering Racial Understanding. And what an appropriate and timely message and theme for us to consider as people who are connected to the Dennis Farm and its magnificent history and research, but an even more appropriate and prescient subject as we deal with a country and a world where we need to work together across and beyond, above and below racial lines to achieve some measure of understanding. I want to commend the Dennis Farm for its ability to grab its history and to catapult its history into our present and our future. That takes a lot of vision. And it's appropriate that this is happening during the month of February, as this is Black History Month, but Black History Month is ultimately American history. And so I like what will happen today because it will be the blending and the fusing and the marrying of Black history with American history. And nobody knows American history and its importance today better than the person who I am prepared to introduce. And that is Zeanne Mason, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Museum of the American Revolution, which is committed to telling a more full and accurate story of America. And its founding and the diversity of the people who contributed to the American Revolution. In 2020, the Philadelphia Business Journal named Zeanne one of the city's women of distinction. But I'll go even further and say I've been an admirer from afar. And so she is someone who is helping to shape these times. And you should listen to her and hear her right now.
Thank you, Reverend Mitchell, for your kind words and for the importance of this discussion, framing this up for us today. It's my great privilege to welcome the many people that have joined from around the world to today's forum on behalf of our board and staff. This is the second year we have had the privilege of partnering with the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust to present the Lonaé A Memorial Forum. Every time I have the opportunity to be with Denise Dennis, whether it's in person or via Zoom, it's a good day. I first met Denise in September of 2015, 2.5 years before our museum opened. We are now happily in our 6th year of working together, having meaningful conversations and collaborations. Denise, it is such an honor to be with you, your family, your wonderful board of directors, and this distinguished panel as we remember Lonaé more and engage in this important dialogue. Since we're not able to gather physically at the museum this year, I do have just a few slides to share with you to give you a sense of what we are doing with our programs and activities at the museum. Oh, that's the last slide. There we go. That's our building. It's at 3rd and Chestnut in Old City, just a few steps from Independence Hall. We are open now Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays from 10 to 5, having put in robust safety protocols for social distancing and cleaning. If you are able to come see us, we are pleased and proud to still have on display a loan of Gershom Prince's decoratively carved powder horn that traces back to Denise's family. I believe she's going to tell us that story later today. This powder horn dates to Gershom Prince's service during the Revolutionary War. And it's a great example of what we work to do throughout our galleries, as Reverend Mitchell spoke about our desire to tell authentic witness objects that uncover and share compelling stories about the diverse people and complex events that sparked America's ongoing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. Throughout the month of February, March, and through April, we have a special exhibit on display titled When Women Lost the Vote. It's a little known fact that more than a century before the passage of the 19th Amendment that we celebrated last year, women and free people of color legally held the vote in New Jersey for more than 30 years. In this exhibit, we explore how the American Revolution shaped women's political opportunities and activism. And it's also a cautionary tale about one of our country's first voting rights crises, another topical subject. There's a robust version of this exhibit online on our website. And tied to the exhibit, we do have a program coming up this Thursday that you can watch virtually that amplifies the story when our curatorial team, two of whom are shown below, Dr. Makuchi and Mead, were doing research for this exhibit. They discovered the name of a Black voter, Ephraim Hagerman, on a New Jersey poll list from 1801. They consulted the Stoutsburg Sauerland African American Museum founders Elaine Buck and Beverly Mills to identify additional Black individuals who voted with him. So in this program, you will join them, and they will be offering a virtual tour of the historical houses and cemeteries that still stand to commemorate these individuals and their legacies. Another wonderful virtual experience you might enjoy. We're so pleased that we were able to put one of our popular in-museum interactives on our website now. It's called Finding Freedom, and it explores the experiences of 5 people of African descent who lived in Virginia in 1781. It uses beautiful watercolor illustrations and first-person narratives to lift up these stories and enable people from around the world now to see the opportunities and challenges the American Revolution presented for them. There are lots of resources and programs that are available for young people, older people, people of all particular, the vast subjects available through the study of the American Revolution on our website, and we hope you might visit us at www.amrevmuseum.org. One of the programs I particularly want to lift up is the next edition of AmRev 360 that will feature Denise Dennis. This will be streamed 10 o'clock on Friday the 26th on our Facebook and YouTube channels, but it will be also archived on our website, and you can watch it at your leisure. But that I know from the people who've seen it, it's really going to be a wonderful conversation with Denise and our president, Dr. Scott Stevenson. So again, thank you to the Dennis Farm Charitable Trust for inviting us to be part of this forum, as together we work to foster racial understanding.
Again, thank you very much. And the work that you're doing is so vital at this time. I really enjoyed the watercolor pictures that I saw, the watercolor paintings rather, that I saw of those 5 individuals who were alive during the revolutionary times. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, imagine what a video tells. Some of you might not have ever visited the Dennis Farm. I have. It's one of my favorite places to go. History comes alive. We've prepared a fantastic video for you so that you get an opportunity to tour the Dennis Farm until you're able to do it live and in person. I hope you'll enjoy this video.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the beautiful, historic Dennis Farm, located in the scenic Endless Mountains of Northeast Pennsylvania. The farm is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is rare as a fully documented farm that for more than 2 centuries has been owned by the same African-American family. My name is Denise Dennis, and I am the 7th generation direct descendant of the free African-American family that came here from New England more than 200 years ago and purchased land. I am also founding president of the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust and will be your guide for this tour. Let's get started. We're entering the lower tier of the 153-acre property, where, to your left, you'll see the farmhouse, sitting on a gentle plateau overlooking mountains in the distance. Before we cross the lawn to the house, let's stop for a minute. These stone walls are the remains of the 3 buildings of the barn complex, originally constructed in the 19th century. You can see the only existing photo of the old barn complex on this sign. You'll find descriptive signs with text and vintage photos of the farm all along the tour. Moving forward, we face the north side of the house, where the Dennis family lived and farmed until 1918. The structure dates back to 1825 and is in fragile condition. In 1939 to 1940, the 2-story, 4-bedroom house was renovated for use as the Dennis family's summer home. In 2011, during Hurricane Irene, the roof of the house collapsed, so we had this pole barn constructed to support the house and protect it from further damage. Today, with the help of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, we are raising funds to restore and convert the farmhouse to a museum. We've climbed the slope to the back of the house on the west side, the most commonly used entrance. The farmhouse is a classic timber frame architectural style, which is common to the region and reflects the New England heritage of the region's early settlers. Now we're facing the south side, where you'll see an entrance to the basement and 2 stone wing walls. The house originally had a center chimney and fireplace. This handsome chimney and the living room fireplace were built during the 1939 and 40 renovation. We've arrived at the east side, or front, of the house. As you can see, the east facade is symmetrical, with the center door flanked by 2 windows. Follow me as we move a half-mile upward along a magical road between the farm's lower and upper tiers. We're now on the section of the road that passes through a shady stand of hemlock trees, overlooking the ravine and the creek that flows through the bottom of the ravine. The road opens onto a field on the upper tier. During the farm's active agricultural years in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were several open fields like this on the farm, where a variety of crops, including winter wheat and Indian corn, were planted, cultivated, and harvested. This upper tier is where the Dennis farm really began. My great-great-great-great-grandparents, Prince and Judith Perkins, who came to this region from Connecticut in 1793, were the first to settle here. They purchased 70 acres of the upper tier and built a homestead out of the wilderness. Their granddaughter, Angeline Perkins, was born on this upper tier. In 1851, Angeline Perkins married Henry W. Dennis, another free African American whose family came to Susquehanna County from New England in 1818. In 1858, when Angeline inherited the Perkins farm, her husband, Henry Dennis, purchased the 100 acres of the lower tier where the house and barn complex are located. Since then, the entire property has been known as the Dennis Farm. Let's turn and continue on a side road through the trees. Deep in the woods, we arrive at what was the heart of the Perkins family homestead, where the family lived and thrived. All that remains today are the stone foundation of the original house, the spring house, and the well. Near the top of the hill, sheltered beneath trees that tower overhead, we find the most sacred acre of the farm, the Perkins Dennis Cemetery and Monument. My ancestors lovingly built the stone walls around the cemetery and forged the iron gate at its entrance by hand. The names of family members who rest here are carved on the monument. From the beginning of our nation's history, this beautiful farm has lived up to the highest American ideals because when slavery was legal in the United States, the Dennis farm was land owned by a hardworking, free African-American family who lived their American dream against great odds. Time stands still on the Dennis farm. I hope you have enjoyed your visit, and if you haven't already, I invite you to come and experience this timeless place for yourself. For now, goodbye.
Thank you, Denise. We've already seen you and we've already heard from you, and you're someone who in this space needs no introduction. In your perfect video, we saw images of a well. And speaking of wells, you are a well of information, determination, and spunk. You have been a traveler globally. You have written in America and abroad. And you and your aunt, Hope Dennis, were real dynamos behind making this happen. And we know a lot were involved, but you two were the dynamos. And so we're grateful to you. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to present to you, you've already heard her and seen her, but somebody who is a 7th generation Pennsylvanian, my dear friend, Denise Dennis.
Oh, thank you, Pastor Mitchell. I'm embarrassed. You touched my heart. And so to you, Zian. I wasn't prepared for all of these, for such praise from everyone. I'm just a girl trying to share her farm with other people. I have a lot of people to thank. I want to thank Zian and the team at the Museum of the American Revolution, particularly Adrienne Whaley, who has been so much fun to work with. Adrienne has a great sense of humor and she gets my corny sense of humor. So it made all of this a treat. Excuse me, I actually have tears in my eyes. Huh. Excuse me. I also want to thank everyone who's with us today, from California to Illinois to Paris. It's just wonderful seeing everyone. I hope I'm on screen. I don't know what happened there. I have vanished from the screen somehow. I can't tell what's going on. Before I continue, I also want to, okay, I'm glad you can see me. Thanks, Adrienne. I also want to thank Team Dennis Farm. And I'll start with our 2 vice presidents, who are also 7th generation direct descendants of the Dennis family. First is our director, our vice president of development, my brother, Daryl Gore. Daryl, do you want to wave? Hi, Daryl. And our next vice president is our vice president of marketing, who was again a 7th generation direct descendant, and my first cousin, who is really like another brother, Lonnie Moore. Lonnie, do you want to salute everybody? Hi. These 2 are also known as my guys, and to embarrass them, but it's true, my princes. And of course, if they're the princes, you know what that makes me. La reine. Okay, moving on. I want to thank our board members, Pastor Marshall Mitchell, whom you've met, and Wade Katz. Wade, are you there? Wade Katz, who has been with us from the beginning. Do you want to wave? Hi, Wade. And Patrice Jepson, who is an invaluable member of our team and brought us, it was Patrice who brought African-American students to the farm for the first time, college students. Hi, Patrice. Thanks for being here. And then we also have from our media team, Phil Condren. Phil, are you there somewhere? Phil and his team. Phil Condren, I know you're there somewhere. I also want to thank from Keystone College. He's not on camera. There's Phil Condren. Hi, Mr. Condren. How are you? Want to wave to everybody? And from Keystone College, even though he's not on camera, we want to thank Lucas Taylor, who is our liaison with Keystone College and also trained student docents to give tours of the farm all the time. And of our advisory council, I don't know whether George Stark has tuned in this year or Michael Wakatama, but I want to acknowledge them. And I also want to acknowledge Al Four, our photographer. We also have an upstate photographer, Ron Parsons. Want to acknowledge them for their hard work. And last, hi, Michael. Michael Wakatama is here. And last but not least, I want to thank Ajana who is our trustee assistant. So I really had to acknowledge everybody because you don't do something like this without a strong supportive team. Now, about today's event. Wow, there's so much going on in the world. When I think of what has happened in the last year, or particularly in the last 4 years, nothing could be more appropriate than our annual Lonaé A Memorial Forum. Lonaé was an 8th generation member of our family. She was also my very first intern. And this summer we were planning the first forum. I remember she was sitting at the table here with me and I told her about this forum and she looked up and she said, you know, I'd like to come to that. And anytime a college student even pays attention to someone my age, you're excited. And sure enough, when it was time for the first forum, which we held at Keystone College, Lonaé contacted her dad and said, I want to come to that. She was a criminal justice major with a wonderful future ahead of her. But before our second forum, Lonaé tragically lost her life in a car accident. And we decided that we would name this forum in her honor because she believed in what we were doing and we believed in her. And she is with us always. There she is, you can see her. So we have renamed the forum. It is now the Lonaé A Memorial Forum. Finally, in my note, I always say a few words about the forum and the panel. I want to thank our panelists. We've got 2 fantastic panelists today, and Pastor will tell you more about them. Excuse me. I want to thank them for coming. When we were planning this event, at one point I said to Adrian, maybe we should call this a vaccine for racism, ? It occurred to me that within 1 year, the finest minds in the world, the greatest scientists, were able to come up with a vaccine for a deadly pandemic. But for centuries, the finest minds across the globe have not been able to come up with a cure for the deadly disease of racism. We are still challenged by racism, particularly in the United States, where it is more ironic because we are supposed to be the bastion of democracy and liberty. A number of years ago, I wrote a book, decades ago, I wrote a book called Black History for Beginners. And I think we have a slide of the book. Yes, this is not the current cover. The current cover, the publishers updated it. The current cover is a raised fist. They wanted it to be a little more dramatic. But anyway, can we go back to the book, please? There were 2 charts from this book. I hope you can see them. They're covered on mine by part of this. If you look at those words, Black codes, slave codes, states' rights, Jim Crow, segregation, discrimination, home rule. When I was researching the book, it occurred to me that from the time Africans were brought to the United States to be enslaved, laws were set up to criminalize them. Anytime an African did anything to assert his or her sense of him or herself as a full human being, equal to a European, it was literally against the law. You could be branded on your cheek for looking a white person in the eye. And after the Black codes, when they first came, slave codes, all of these laws that you see here were done to put African people outside the law. In other words, making them outlaws just for feeling themselves to have self-agency and to be full human beings. And every time we fought back, people of like mind, Black and white together, Black and white and all races together, have fought back against racism, there has been a backlash. And I think we all know that we're going through a period of backlash right now. Consequently, it won't be easy to cure racism, but hopefully we can find ways to overcome it and do better. Before I conclude my remarks, Zian mentioned the powder horn. One of our ancestors, we have several ancestors, at least a couple who were in the American Revolution, who fought. Imagine Black people fighting for these ideals that our country stands for. And one of them was killed in what is known as the Wyoming, Pennsylvania massacre in 1778, the only Revolutionary War battle in upstate Pennsylvania. His name is Gershom Prince. And taken from his body was this beautiful powder horn, a cow's horn that he put his gunpowder in, and he had beautiful carvings on it, plus his name. He identified himself as a Negro. He has that carved on there. And he actually carved it during the French and Indian War at Crown Point on September 3rd, 1761, I believe. That is now, the powder horn is now on display in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And it is the only artifact taken from an African-American who was killed in battle in the American Revolution. So all the way back to the French and Indian War, people of color helped to fight for what the Declaration said, the light that all men are created equal. And we fought the hard battle. Americans have held the Constitution up as the standard and said, you must live up to this. The journey is not over. The battle is not yet won. The challenge is before us. And we hope, as I say every year, I hope that all of you leave today with more tools in your toolbox for fighting the good fight, for combating racism in your personal lives and your communities. And I must add, today there has been a great outrage with racism against Asian Americans. So it isn't just African Americans. Racism exists in all places against so many different types of people, and we just all collectively must do better. So I hope today's program inspires you, and thank you again for joining us today, my friends everywhere.
Denise, thank you so much for your inspiring work and for your unflinching commitment to the Dennis Farm, to Lonaé's memory, and to helping to heal us as a nation. This fourth forum is titled Solutions for Overcoming Racism. And I want to invite, this is very interactive, I want to invite our students who are out there to participate in the student video contest for cash awards. And we know that in 1761, there were certainly not cash awards for anybody who wanted to do anything. If you could just eke out an existence, you counted that as a blessing. But we want to entice and to encourage our students who are here participating in the student video contest that a cash award will be available. And look at those numbers on it. First place, $250. Second place, $150. Third place, $100. You need to submit your 1 to 2 minute video essay by March 8th, 2021 to compete for a cash prize. I want to encourage them and others to visit the Dennis Farm, Dennis, DENNIS, farm, FARM.org for full contest rules, and guidelines. It is a worthwhile experience, and I know you will get a lot out of it. And understanding and seeing the relevance of this history, particularly as we talk about solutions for overcoming racism, is particularly important. It was just 118 years ago that W.E.B. Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century would be and was and is the problem of the color line. And I'm not certain that Professor Du Bois is not accurate also about the 21st century. It is still a problem that we are seeking to overcome, and that is why our theme, Solutions for Overcoming Racism, is particularly poignant today. We have two people with us today who are brilliant scholars and accomplished. They're doers. Alexandria Harris, Esquire. She's executive director of the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Alexandria Harris is the executive director who spends her time addressing these issues, and in her role, she's responsible for activating the foundation's goal and vision through the strategic and sustainable growth of the organization. Alexandria first became passionate about voting when she was in elementary school. It indeed starts very early, which is why a museum and a farm teaching these things from the earliest stages of life, those things are particularly important. She participated in many local and national campaigns, organized and registered students to vote on campus, and successfully lobbied the Georgia state legislature to enact a law that allowed a voter to cast a provisional ballot if they believed they were entitled to vote. The law was the precursor to the provisional vote law enjoyed across the United States today. She is a trailblazer. Alexandria practiced corporate law for nearly a decade. She left the law to become a social entrepreneur, opened a school, and has since helped nonprofits around the world scale up their operations. She earned a BA from Spelman College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Our second guest, Professor Charles Gallagher, professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Salle University. Chip Gallagher's research focuses on racial and social inequality and the ways in which the media, the state, and popular cultures constructs, shapes, and disseminates ideas around race. There clearly is a confluence and they cross-pollinate. His published articles on the sociological functions of colorblind political narratives, how racial categories expand and contract within the context of interracial marriages, race theory, racial innumeracy, and how one's ethnic history shapes perceptions of privilege. Chip was a Fulbright US-UK research scholar at the University of Birmingham in England from 2016 through 2017. As an internationally recognized expert on race relations, immigration, and social justice. Chip is a frequently called upon as a media source for commentary and analysis on these issues, and it is my pleasure to welcome Alex and Chip to this forum. Welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Pastor. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me pull up my PowerPoint so we can get started here. I'm going to share a screen. Share. I'm going to do a slideshow from the beginning. And welcome. Welcome, everyone. And I want to, of course, thank the Dennis Farm and the Museum of American Revolution for putting on what I think is an extremely important forum to discuss issues of race and racism, and for today, specifically around issues of criminal justice. I also want to particularly thank you to Ms. Dennis for organizing this. It's very needed, and I'm particularly elated that we have a sizable number of people that are students, because it really is, it's almost a cliche, but you really are our future. And so what I'm going to do today, I was charged with discussing racism within the context of criminal justice, causes and effect. And it really is a very large topic, but I'm going to try to do two things today. And the first thing I want to do is I want to look at, just briefly, kind of a quick but yet deep dive into why do our prisons look the way they do now? Why are our prisons disproportionately filled with Black and brown people, predominantly males? And it's really something that has happened in the last 50 years. And I want a disclaimer right now. I want to you know that I'm not a criminologist, I'm a sociologist. There's a little difference. And so my criminologist friends might take issues with some of the things I'm saying, but as a sociologist, I'm more interested in the kind of macro, larger approaches. And Miss Dennis got into some of these things, that what happened in 1700 or 1861 or in 1924 resonates today. And it's what they call past and present discrimination. So that's going to be the second part of the talk that I'm going to do. And I kind of have to rush through things, but so you know, I'm going to give you a website so you can have my PowerPoint at the end. But what I'm interested in looking at, and kind of the research I'm doing now, is really at the institutional level. How is systemic racism, how is it reproduced every generation by institutions? And that's, I'm going to link the two things, criminal justice and it's really kind of a deprivation argument about opportunity. So the United States, just some background information, right? When we say we mass incarcerate, we are an incarceration nation. No one else in the world looks like us. So we're 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. This is just unbelievable. And I wanted to give you a little context about how this looks relative to other countries, right? This is basically Europe. They threw Russia in there. I think a quarter of the landmass of Russia is in Europe, but this is what Europe looks like. We don't look like anyone. I mean, in Europe, aside from Russia, we think of kind of as a totalitarian state, right? We really, there's something going on in the United States, and it's not that we are more criminal. It's not that we're more criminal. It's how we police and how we incarcerate. And that is the fundamental difference. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. And if you look at nations in Europe that look a little bit more like us, like these are our NATO friends, again, we are literally off the charts. We don't look like anyone in Europe, right? And you have to ask yourself, as a sociologist, wow, something is going on. There has to be an explanation for this. And so then, like, well, we don't look like the UK. We certainly don't look like Norway. You would ask yourself, well, who do we look like, right? Well, we look like El Salvador. And this should be just shocking. And I've been in Central America. It's a beautiful region, but El Salvador is considered a failed state. Narco-terrorism is really very much a concern. Very organized gangs basically control large parts of the country. But that's who we look like in terms of our incarceration. So it's really, there is something going on in the United States. It is unique to a first world or developed country, right? So when did mass incarceration really start to move in the United States? It seems that we've been talking about it so much in the last 30 or 40 years, it would seem that it's been around forever. That's just simply not the case. The way that we understand mass incarceration, it really starts 50 years ago. And you can see the slope of this line, like this mountain of incarcerated people really starts in 80. And it is, of course, you know what it is. It's the war on drugs. And we'll talk a little about the war on drugs, but if you see here, what's going on here are policies. These are federal policies that went into place. And the effect was to incarcerate millions of people, right? So we have Kennedy, we have Nixon, and then we have the war on drugs under Reagan. We have mandatory minimums. I'm going to go through this a little bit, but what we should know and what's important was that the crime rate was relatively flat. It goes up a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but it takes off. And the reason is basically the war on drugs. And we're going to see that the war on drugs isn't even applied equally across groups, right? Because I'm going to show you that the fact is that we know from NIH that people do drugs at the same rate, that white people are just as likely to smoke marijuana as black people or brown people. The same thing with harder drugs. But look who is in jail on drugs charges. And I'm going to show you these numbers in a second. But it's because the law and policing aren't applied equally. Right? So this is a steep curve that I want you to see what's happened in the last 40 years, right? So again, you have probably seen statistics like this in the newspaper at the rate, right? The disproportionately higher rates that Black and Latino people are put in jail. And the number here is just pretty shocking as well, right? 1 in 3 African-American men versus 1 in 17 men have a chance of going to prison in their lives. This is pretty shocking. And the question I want to ask today is why? And there are two answers to this. One, it is the way we police. and the way our corrections work and the way we jail people. That's one thing. But I want to argue too that there's a larger, more systemic issue going on, and it's fundamentally about poverty and opportunity. And if you can see, I stole this slide from the Jim Crow Project. For those of you that have not read it yet, I strongly suggest reading Michelle Alexander's fabulous book on the new Jim Crow. And she has a new updated, there's a revised version that just came out where she has a new introduction and new data. It's very, very good. But in a nutshell, what she does, and she does brilliantly, is she draws a line, a direct line from the institution of slavery to Jim Crow and sharecropping to the convict leasing program, right? Prison labor, and then again to Jim Crow, and then Jim Crow ends in the 60s, and Jim Crow is replaced by mass incarceration. And the bottom line of this book is the way the Black population has been controlled since 1619 to now. And so a lot of this is about mass incarceration. So it's a really good starting point for any students that might be interested in criminal justice or sociology. So what were some of the policies that have gotten us here? I'm going to kind of run through these, right? Broken windows, everybody has heard of broken windows. There's enormous prevalence. Giuliani embraced it, Clinton embraced it. It was embraced by big city leaders. And the idea, it's an argument about disorganization. When you see a building with broken windows, it's suggesting to other people that no one's taking care of the property. And that property in turn becomes a place where other criminals hang out. People use it as a shooting gallery. It becomes criminal. And the idea is the second a window is broken, fix the window. Someone tags a wall, paint over it. It shows that people in the community care. This is a theory that got enormous traction among our city mayors. And so these are the 5, I don't want to go through these 5 facts, but I want to point something out here that's very important. This is the academics that coined the term. Again, number 3, crime and disorder flourish. Neglected environments get worse. Number 5 is what's important. Long-term solutions require community buy-in and collaboration. That community buy-in never happened. When people thought about broken windows, the idea it would be collaborative. The police and policing, basically police and the community. So when I say community, the ministers in the community, a town watch, community leaders, local people in the community working with police to basically make their neighborhood safer. The idea was there had to be buy-in from the community and from the police. But you know what happened, right? What happened was broken windows became stop and frisk, zero tolerance policing, and racial profiling. That is, the community agent of broken windows never happened. And what police found was really effective was basically stop and frisk, profiling. This is Philadelphia. And again, I'm happy to send you these PowerPoints because I'm going to go through a lot of stuff here. But what's important here to see is that the Black population in Philadelphia is 43%. But as you can see here, they make up 68% of stops. They make 70% of frisks, right? So this is what we say is overrepresentation. And when something is overrepresented over and over again, as a sociologist, you have to ask why. It's not random. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. Same thing here. This is a little easier to read in some ways, right? This is Philadelphia, right? And I like this because the arrows here. This is the population, right? So the Black population is just horribly overrepresented in stops. So broken windows as an idea that academics coined as a way to think about neighborhoods that were disorganized becomes the motivation for a whole different kind of policing. And this is the policing we're seeing here is stop and frisk, zero tolerance, and racial profiling. Again, this is another chart that more or less shows the same thing. We have here arrests, street stops, use of force, lethal use of force, right? Above the line means it's overrepresented. Below the line means it's underrepresented. So again, here we see that Blacks for every category are overrepresented. This is, quite honestly, a policy. These are policies, right? And as I said earlier, and I don't have a slide for this, but if you were to police in an upper middle class white neighborhood, if you were to drive around and you were to pat down high school kids that are 17, 18, or maybe freshman college, you would find drugs on them. Because we know people, it doesn't matter what racial group you're in, we know that groups are equally likely to do drugs at the same rate. So if you were in the suburbs and police were constantly patting down upper middle class white kids, they'd be in jail. But that, of course, that isn't where we police, right? And so that's why we're seeing this dragnet happen, right? Another policy, 3 strikes and you're out. It doesn't matter if you have a 3rd strike. And initially when this law came up, it didn't matter what the 3rd strike would be. If you stole a slice of pizza, if you grabbed someone's purse, it didn't matter. And then automatically you were going to be in jail for a very, very, very long time. 3 strikes and you're out. Again, all these policies cumulatively explain why the millions of people we see in jail today. This is another mandatory minimums, right? Mandatory minimums, they thought it was very effective, that you had to serve, right? The judge had to impose a penalty on you regardless. First offense, doesn't matter. Judges historically have had a lot of discretion in what they choose to do with someone that is in front of them. That goes away. So mandatory minimums, of course, there was racial disparities in this as well. Again, these were all policies put in place in the 80s and 90s, and the effect would be absolutely brutal on certain populations in the United States, right? So then we have also, this is truth in sentencing, right? So if it's supposed to be 15 years in jail, you can't do 80% of it or 70% of it. Let's say you're in jail and you have been a model prisoner. You got your GED, you got clean and sober. You were an excellent prisoner. You're not getting any good time. You're not getting parole. You have to be in X amount. So truth in sentencing mean if they put you in jail, if it says 10 years, you're going to be in for 10 years. So what does this mean? It means that people in jail for way longer than they were, say, 30 years ago. Again, these are all the policies. When you ask yourself, well, how did our prisons get to look like this? It's not one policy. It's a multiplicity of policies at the state and city level, basically, that have made our prisons look the way they do, right? Again, this is pre-trial. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds here. This is basically means you've not been convicted. You're in jail waiting, and the number has skyrocketed. And of course, there's a race effect to this. So what this also gets at is you can't pay bail. Why can't you pay bail? Because you're poor, right? And there's one thing we all know, there's not a lot of rich people in prison, right? You can pay bail and you can get something called a really good lawyer, right? So, so this is back to corrections, right? This is back to racial disparities in bail. And this is, again, the bail system. And again, I'll send this to you if you like, but it's at every level, right? It's at bail, it's at pretrial, it's at sentencing, it's at parole. And then you get out and you have to check the box, right? If you're applying for a job, there are many job applications where they say, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you have to, there's now an idea about banning the box, right? But it means now, again, these things follow you. So these are the policies that we have put in place over the last 40 years that explain why our prisons look the way they do, right? So, but I want to now shift gears, and this is kind of where the bigger sociological picture comes in, right? There's a line I've always liked, right, by Marcus Aurelius. Poverty is the mother of crime, right? And that's what I want to talk about as a sociologist. What does poverty do? Poverty fundamentally creates strain, right? And this is one theory in sociology and criminology. It's called strain theory. It's also called differential opportunity theory. And fundamentally, it means that you buy into the goals of society. You want to be middle class. You want all those nice things, but the means aren't there for you to get there. And you know what the means are. The means are doing well in high school and then going to college and getting a good job, right? That's the means that we typically buy into. That path is cut off for tens of millions of people in the United States of America. Now, let's be real clear. Most people that are poor or very modest means never get in trouble with the law. But there's going to be a part of that population that wants those nice things. They have bought into the goal of looking good and driving well, but they're not going to get there legitimately. They're going to find other ways to do it. And that's what this theory is fundamentally about. And so that's what I want to look at right now, is that fundamentally what I'm saying here is that poverty equals blocked opportunities. And these blocked opportunities are rooted. They are rooted in failed and racist social institutions. Now, the list I'm going to give you that I'm going to go through quickly is not exhaustive. I could go into other things, but that would be a 14-week class. But this is what I want to look at, right? That these institutional failures are systemic and interrelated, right? The housing market, occupational segregation, wealth accumulation, schooling, right? And all of these things cumulatively can result in increased crime and delinquency. And let me just explain to you quickly how, right? So our Philadelphia, right? I'm a 4th generation Philadelphia. My city of brotherly love is unbelievably segregated. And this is something that Ms. Dennis brought up, is that the reality is that this segregation has been here for a long time. And there's reasons for it historically, and the reason it's by design, and it's redlining. Banks literally circled neighborhoods and wouldn't give them credit. It's restricted covenants. Black or brown people or Jews, different immigrant groups weren't allowed to buy in certain neighborhoods, right? Block busting, right? Steering. This is when a real estate agent won't take you into certain neighborhoods or only directs you to a certain neighborhood, right? And then of course, when all this doesn't work, you can always firebomb someone's house. And Philadelphia has many neighborhoods where this has happened. A Black family moves in and things happen to their house. Terrorism, right? And again, these things, I'm going to be very clear about it. Redlining, restricted covenants were blessed by the federal government. They were blessed by the state of Pennsylvania. That's institutional, right? This isn't a one-off bad actor. This was baked into our housing policy. And so this is just another visual. I like this because you get a really clear sense. We are a very, very segregated city. So the greater Northeast is basically white. We have up here Chestnut Hill, right? We have here North Philadelphia. This is the greater Northeast. What you can see this, right? This isn't where say, oh, well, people like to live amongst themselves. No, that is not how it's played out historically, is that people weren't allowed to easily move to neighborhoods. And what you're looking at, right? You don't think that all the things you're looking at, people own these properties, right? But most people, and this is what I want to get at, home ownership rates. And being able to own a home, right? A piece of the rock, the American dream, is extremely important. And I'll tell you why in a second, right? So look at these rates here, right? So what's happened is that the homeownership rate for Latinos, for African Americans has gotten better, right? But it's still, the differential is unbelievable. And actually Zillow did a very nice job looking at this over time. From 1900 to now, the fundamental difference has been around 30%. So it hasn't moved that much. And you might be asking yourself, well, why does this matter, right? So maybe if you're a high school student or college student, you're like, well, what's the point here? Well, what matters enormously is the wealth you get from your house, which I'll get to in a second. In 2008, the market popped, right? We had a bubble. Who got hurt, right? Well, this is the bad story. The sad story is that African Americans and Latinos got hurt the most. We know that from foreclosure rates. And again, why does this matter in terms of, again, what we're thinking about our opportunity, right? Well, I'm sorry, what does the house do? But how did this happen, right? I'm getting ahead of myself, excuse me. Predatory lending, right? This is when there's a lot of different ways this plays out. We know from very good HUD studies, African-American couple with exactly the same credentials go into a bank, and a white couple with exactly the same credentials as the Black couple go in, and they're offered different interest rates. We know that housing discrimination plays out in the financial market, in the actual getting of housing and rentals. Payday loans, no credit checks, right? All these things happen. I have up Wells Fargo and I have Bank of America because they got sued for billions of dollars for engaging in racial discrimination against homeowners. So again, baked into the system. And remember, these banks are regulated by the federal government. So again, this is when I talk about institutions, I'm talking about big banking institutions that were doing what they wanted. So why does this matter, right? For most Americans, the single largest asset they have is the equity in their house, right? That's why it's so important when we looked at the numbers between African Americans that own a house and white Americans, because eventually when grandma or great grandma dies, that money can go to the grandkids, and it can be fundamentally transformative, right? The idea that that money allows someone to invest in their grandson's education, or maybe helping to pay for college, or maybe helping someone buy a house, right? It's extremely important. And as we can see in the United States of America, the wealth disparities are unbelievably different. And a way to always remember this, the simplest way, it's a dime on the dollar. For every dollar of wealth that someone white has, African Americans have a dime, right? And this is an easy way to think about it. And so this is median family wealth. And I found another slide that I think is kind of cool as well. It's not the median, it's the average. It's this number here. This number is staggering, right? So I know average isn't the best way to look at a population distribution, but the idea is that basically it takes generations. It takes multiple generations to build wealth. And if you weren't able to build wealth 3 generations ago because you didn't have access to decent jobs, or you weren't allowed to go to colleges, right? What happens 3 generations forward is exactly what you're looking at. And so if wealth accumulation through housing isn't possible, then maybe you can do it through work, right? Well, maybe not. When you look at basically occupation in the United States, there's residential segregation, there's also occupational segregation, right? When we look at folks that make the most money and the kind of jobs they are, they're monopolized by white Americans, right? So then the flip side of this, okay, well, what are jobs that Black people do? And we can see they're overrepresented in jobs. And again, all these jobs are honorable. People work very hard, but they're not very highly remunerative. They don't pay a lot of money. And if you earn a lot of money, then at least you can save money and you can pass this money on intergenerationally, right? So these are the kinds of structures that are in place already that for us to move forward with systemic racism, we have to address, right? So schooling, and this is, I found this in our area. And if you look at two schools that I'm familiar with with Lower Merion. And if you look at Philadelphia, right? If you look at Overbrook High School and you look at Lower Merion High School, two schools that are separated by about 3 miles, there's about a $10,000 difference in the amount of money spent per pupil, right? And that is an enormous amount of money in terms of teaching and supplies and laboratories, right? And languages and sports, right? Poverty rates. So let's look at schooling and poverty. Philadelphia has a very large poor population in their elementary and high schools. And what we know is that poverty creates its own set of obstacles. But again, concentrated poverty in public schools. And when you start to look down, Lower Merion, I'm using as an example, they have almost no kids, 4% of the student population that is poor, right? So again, what do we know? Well, we know that these schools are very, very under-resourced. It often means that children aren't reading to level. It also means that their graduation rates are lower. It also means that they're not being prepared to go to college. And so how does poverty, in the case here of poverty and education, affect learning at the earliest age? This is a very, very respected study. The folks lived in people's households for months. And it turns out that if you're upper middle class, and again, this is the intersection of race and class, right? That there's way more upper middle class families that are white than Black. If you count the amount of vocabulary a child has when they're 3, it's 1,100 words versus 525 words. That's at 3. And now, of course, you know that we're so enamored with assessment. This gets picked up in standardized tests. And as the last line of this slide says, the researchers found early language skill was a reliable predictor for school performance in later life. You know, yes, but it's not. It's really a predictor of your parents' vocabulary, which is a manifestation of class, and class and race get tied together, right? It's really a measure of how middle class you are. So again, back to schooling. Suspensions. What do we know about suspensions? And again, this gets us to the pipeline people always talk about, the high school to prison pipeline. Suspension expulsions are higher in low income schools. And then we look at this, and again, breaking the data down, they're higher, right, in schools where there's a greater percentage of African-American and Hispanic students. So, and this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the new school. Right? It's really in many ways, some schools are almost in some ways mini prisons. The panopticon is there. There's a police officer there. There's zero tolerance, right? And what might have been when I was a kid, a little disruption, now you're expelled. And once you're expelled, you're going to start on a path in all likelihood means you're not going to finish high school, or it becomes more difficult. Right? So these are the larger structural issues I just kind of wanted to bring to your attention. And this is my last slide of substance, right? We spend a lot of money keeping people in prison, anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 a year, depending what state you're in, right? And we need to think, is this how we want to spend society's money? And we're spending, right, more money, California's spending more money putting people in prison than they are putting people in college. And again, these are political choices. So I'll leave you with this, and I apologize that I wish, you know, Ms. Dennis got it right. We know what the problem is. I'm going to put up solutions, but we have been talking about these solutions for generations, and the will isn't there. The political will isn't there, right? So pardon my idealism, but this is the things we have to appraise. Affordable housing. We have not replaced the affordable housing we've knocked down in the United States in the last 30 years. There's lots of luxury housing. There's not affordable housing, right? Equity in our schools, right? The way that we finance, the way that we basically fund our schools is really, it's classist and it's racist. It's property taxes. And of course, that has to change a huge political football. Defunding the police, very bad words now, it's not. I don't think a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania needs a SWAT team. The idea is you don't get rid of police, you move monies into things where you basically help your constituents. Mental health issues, social work issues, drug counseling. Police officers shouldn't be doing that, right? How do we dismantle the prison industrial complex? A lot of it is basically new drug laws. Drug facilities, and I make a quick point about this. I came through the 80s in Philadelphia when there was a crack epidemic, and it was horrible the way it was presented in the public. It was very, very racist. It was really, really ugly. Now we have the opioid scourge, and it's horrible also. But because it's affecting lots of white people, it's now a public health issue. So, but nonetheless, so every way we can get there is good. But we need to think about drug and drug addiction as a public health issue, right? Gainful employment, New Deal, build the infrastructure. We can put people to work if we want to, a living wage, job training, national health care. And then, this was brought up when the Reverend was speaking and Ms. Dennis was speaking. We need moral leadership. We need people that are empathetic about the plight that people are experiencing in the United States. And we need people to use the bully pulpit, to stand on the stump and make an argument about equity. So again, not that it was optimistic presentation, but we have to understand how we got here to figure out where we can go to make society more equitable, less racist, and more equal. And so I'm happy to share this with anyone. That's my email. You can either do it through me or through anyone on the screen. So all in there. And let me start. Okay, beautiful.
Chip, Baptist ministers are notoriously guilty of going on and on beyond what other people want to hear. I can tell you right now, you did not commit that sin. I wanted you to push further and further. So very well done. We'll come back at the end and do a little bit of Q&A. I also appreciated your introduction of some, you touched the third rails in America, poverty and race. And so I think we'll have a good time with it. And without further delay, let's hear from Alexandria Harris. Her presentation will come back at the end for Q&A, and we'll toss a couple of questions your way and her way. And we certainly hope, because we want this to be interactive, that people who are out there in the audience or congregation will throw some questions your way, and we'll sort through them. So without further delay, let's hear from Alex.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and this is extremely exciting. And I'm happy to be presenting right after Professor Gallagher, because there's so much that complements our presentation. So just let me do a full screen. Here we go. Great. So one of the things that I just want to underscore and highlight some of the things that Professor Gallagher shared in kind of a personal experience. So as was highlighted before, I have a kind of long and strange career that took me from Storrs, Connecticut. And I want to start, actually, before we go any further, I want to start by shouting out a ton of Farrar family members that are here participating. And so they represent my family that was enslaved in Virginia. So we are not that far out of enslavement. Obviously in America, my great-grandparents were enslaved in Virginia. And so I was educated in Storrs, Connecticut, where I experienced a lot of effects of racism, which really speak to the public education issues that Professor Gallagher pointed out. I was told all the time that I was stupid. I was put in, taken off the college track, which I had to fight to get back on. And then even when I got to Harvard Law School, my classmates, when we were going out and getting our first post-law school degrees, we were experiencing what it is to be Black and professional and only, several steps out of poverty. So I looked at my classmates who had these great law firm jobs, but often were supporting other relatives. And so then all of the things that Professor Gallagher was talking about that really underscore this wealth gap in America become very real and in real time. So you can have this fantastic degree and this fantastic job, but you're only so far out of the stretch of racism in America. And then, of course, all of these things that speak to the differences between the experience of white Americans and Black Americans as it really, as we interact with the criminal justice system. What's really interesting is wealth and education really have very little to do with it. So many of my classmates and friends and family members who are very educated have had run-ins with the criminal justice system, including me, with a Harvard Law School degree, being pulled over, experiencing police officers putting guns in my face, being pulled over. So all of this stuff, really, what are we trying to, when we're talking about overcoming racism, clearly there's an underlying issue. So even if we address all these policies, we have to speak to the hearts of people. So when I speak today, I wanna, this topic about racism in America, it's so deep. 30 minutes, 2 hours, 2 years on this topic really will be insignificant and won't allow me to begin to even address how we overcome something that is as American as apple pie. Racism in America, this is one of the things that I've heard consistently. When people challenge racism in America, people get upset because they feel like they're challenging America, because racism in America are so interlocked, it's hard to distinguish. So when we're talking about these things and solutions, please understand that this is a conversation. This is not a presentation, or at least this is a bit of a presentation, but I'll make it short because I want us to thought partner and really share our own experiences and talk about what we think will be the best solutions to combat this thing that is so large. Racism in America, the racism that my great-grandparents experienced, is not the same racism that my mom experienced and that I experienced. The racism that I've kind of highlighted through my education, it's changing. And so the things that we are talking about, I'm kind of an old millennial, there are young millennials, there are Gen Zers, the things that we're experiencing are evolving and they're changing. And they're becoming a little bit more in the fine print of these policies. But one thing that I want to talk about is how you, as a young person, can really claim your power. Because as I've noted, racism in America has really changed. But what we are seeing, and Ms. Dennis really talked about this, is young people are claiming their power, are claiming their position, are demanding change. And there's a lot in that. So a lot of the older generations demanded change in one way, but young people today, the way that you're claiming change is so important and needed. So I want to provide a couple of suggestions of ways I think that we can really make some movement. And so voting. It was highlighted that I am the executive director of the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and we are very narrowly focused on the power of young people and their voices in democracy. And our focus, especially in 2020, was very heavily on voting and the change that young people can make through voting. Certainly at the beginning of 2020, we heard from a lot of young people that they were disgusted. They wanted to take to the streets and really protest and demand change in that way. And we're not that excited, at least in the beginning of 2020, in going to the polls to demand change through the ballot. And I want to start by saying, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but I think there's a lot of power in protest. And so there's certainly been a question about whether protest matters. I say that it does, it matters a lot. And I want to also highlight and underscore the importance of voting, because I think it's often overlooked. So when people talk about voting, oftentimes they're talking about voting for the president, for these big federal elections. And people don't usually think about the importance of voting locally. what you'll find if you really go through and look, we are most affected by the elections of our local elected officials. So you think about our mayors, our governors, but then go even more local. Think about our school boards and all these other pieces. When I was recruiting young people to not only vote, we were recruiting people to be poll workers, because there is a lot of power as a poll worker. If any of you ever went to a nightclub, you know that the bouncer has all the power about whether you get in or you get out. I always make the analogy, it's the same thing with a poll worker. When I went to Spelman, I got there in 2000, and the election at the time was Bush v. Gore. And I had spent a lot of time, because my mother is highly politically active, and so are a lot of members of my family. So that was instilled in me. I always went to vote with her. So when I got to Spelman, the very first thing that I wanted to do was vote. I was super excited about it because I knew the power of voting. And so I set out to register all of my classmates at Spelman, went to Morehouse, went to Clark Atlanta, Morris Brown, went to Georgia State. We were serious about it. And I even started a couple of local organizations on campus and other campuses to register other people to vote. So we registered thousands of people. And so when I went to go vote for the first time, I showed up to the poll. I had my confirmation card. It was yellow. I was so excited. And the poll worker said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not registered to vote." I said, "Oh, surely you have made a mistake, because here's my confirmation card. Here's my license. I know I'm registered. I know I'm ready to go." She said, "Sorry, baby, you're not voting today." And I won't spare you all the details, but I did not vote that day. And I remember I was devastated. And as an African-American woman, I think it's very hard to make me feel any less American than I did in that moment. Certainly I'd felt that, that this was a very important moment for me as an American, and I was denied my first opportunity to vote as a registered voter. But I'm also very persistent. So not only did I stand there and demand that I be allowed to vote, which, ultimately I wasn't, but I asked everybody in the precinct who was being turned away to stay. And I went outside and I said, "Everybody go back in the precinct." I ran upstairs, got on a phone and called all of the radio stations, all the TV stations, and said, "Go back to your precinct, demand that you be allowed to vote." And we had a sit-in at our precinct, and we were singing spirituals. And I was on radio and I was on TV, and I said, "Go back to your precincts." And I was calling everybody on the ballot. I was saying, "Do you know that they're turning people away? Do you know what's happening?" And they said, "Yeah, we know." And have you heard of Florida? It's happening out all over the country. People are being turned away. And it was particularly in these Black precincts. And so I was so devastated and so disgusted by the fact that when the sun set and it was 7 p.m. and the polls closed, I actually didn't get to vote. And if this were a movie, I would have been allowed to vote, because after all that, surely I'd be allowed to vote. But I wasn't. And so I went home. I was really upset. I called my mom. I think I was crying. And she said, "Write a letter to the Secretary of State and tell her, while you're angry, what happened." And I had collected in my notebook that day the names and numbers of everybody who had been turned away from the polls, and it filled my notebook. So I put that in there with my very strongly worded letter, and I complained. And we sent that off to the Secretary of State. And I really didn't think much more about that letter. But then I began organizing and I became an activist, and we started petitioning the legislature. And I would speak on panels, and I would speak in press moments, and there'd be media there, and I'd talk about my experience, and I just became a thorn in the side of the Secretary of State. And she sent the Assistant Secretary of State to come to my dorm to recruit me to work for her to make a change. And so together, they used to call it, I was formerly Alexandria Lee. They used to call it the Alexandria Lee Bill. It was Senate Bill 213, and they pushed that forward until it became law. And that law changed the ability for people like me, when they show up with a confirmation card, to actually have the opportunity to vote. And I just say this to say that there's so much power in being young. Often people are waiting for the old people or someone else to come and make a change, but there's so much that you can do, and your vote really, really matters. So when people talk about why voting matters. Like I said, they're always thinking about presidential elections. They're thinking about the Donald Trumps and the Bidens and the Obamas. But I think about Breonna Taylor. I think about what happened subsequently, being shot in her own home and nothing happening to those police. And when we think about the power of a poll worker, certainly the Attorney General of Kentucky has a ton of power. Think about the fact that there were no charges brought against the police officers who did that to her, and still. And then we think about, and some of the stats that are on the screen, about people who did not vote. Over half of the population of Kentucky registered voters that could have voted for that Attorney General did not vote. And what will happen with Daniel Cameron after? Hopefully something will be done, but it takes people paying attention to everybody on the ballot, going all the way down and voting, not just in these, on elections, but the off elections, so that we can make sure that there is justice for people like Breonna Taylor in their own home. Similarly, police commissioners are appointed by mayors, and they have a lot of power. So we're talking about defunding police. We're talking about holding police accountable when they kill people, unarmed people. You have to think about mayoral elections and the power of mayors and what they do. And certainly all of the people that they appoint, and the effect of being in power and what it means to have people of color in those positions of power. So I lived for a very long time in Brooklyn, and all of the things that Professor Gallagher was mentioning when we're talking about stop and frisk, and how that affected so many people that I know, and the neighborhood that I lived in Bed-Stuy, where people would just get snatched up, and police are just absolutely have almost limitless power in these major cities. What happens when there are complaints about those police officers? Where does it go? Who's in charge? Who's making the policy? All the day-to-day ways that we're affected by those in power. A lot of this stuff we can begin to affect with our vote by paying attention. And there's been a lot said. Because of my background as a lawyer, I spent a lot of time not only doing criminal defense, but also I was a federal clerk. And I remember all of the ways that my federal judge that I worked for felt like his hands were tied as a judge. But there's so much power, just like I said, the bouncer experience with the poll worker. Prosecutors have so much power. And I can tell you, they can decide, yes, I'll bring charges, or no, I won't. Let this person go. It's that simple. And I've had so many experiences where I've written to prosecutors, or I've reached out to a friend who's a prosecutor and say, all right, don't worry about it. Throw that one out. It's outrageous how much power prosecutors have. And it's outrageous how few Black prosecutors there are in the country, and how few women prosecutors there are in the country. And these are, largely elected positions. So if we're not paying attention to who our prosecutors are, then we are saying that all the things that Professor Gallagher was talking about, there's an underlying piece here. Trayvon Martin, let's talk about jurors. Jurors are often, they come from you signing up to vote. So, by the way, I've always loved being called for jury duty. A lot of people try to get out of jury duty. You want to be on a jury. It's important that juries are reflecting our community, so that when people are going up for trials, whether fairly or unfairly, that the voice of the people is being heard. And so when Trayvon Martin's case was being decided, and whether he was murdered or whether there was some kind of something else happened that was a little bit more innocent, you consistently heard from the jurors that they felt like Zimmerman was rightfully acting because Trayvon Martin was menacing or scary, this child. And so when I speak to young people and they feel like this was an injustice, the prosecutor had a lot of power. What types of charges were brought? you know, whether the person was released, whether they would bring serious charges or light charges, all this stuff really, really matters. The jurors matter. All of this you can affect by whether you register to vote and whether you show up to vote. This is a funny, you know, quote people remember when Obama was on the campaign trail and people were booing a man who was booing him, who was in military attire. And he said, "Don't boo, vote." And this became a mantra all throughout the campaign that he was running. Don't boo, vote. You don't matter unless you vote. April Ryan is a White House correspondent, and she's like a giant and amazing, and she's great stories. And one of the stories she told was Bill Clinton putting his arm around her and saying, "You know, your people don't matter because your people don't vote." She's African American. And this is one of the things that we know. When people show up and vote, then their elected officials feel like they have more influence and what they say matters. So what's really cool and amazing right now is because young people had record number of turnout in this last election, young people have a megaphone. So what we think and what we say really matters. But previously, young people, particularly college students, were seen as a very unclear voting bloc. And often we're seen as a voting bloc that didn't matter. So when people are campaigning, they go to the voting blocs that matter, those who are gonna either put a lot of money out or bring a lot of people out. And because young people voted so aggressively in this last election, presidential election, we know that this will be a voting bloc that'll be considered. You have to vote to matter. And this is a thing that's been consistently said. If you don't vote, you don't matter, but it really is true. But voting isn't as easy as people say. And certainly my own experience, my very first time trying to vote, I wasn't able to vote because of voter suppression. I actually experienced voter suppression during this last election, which is insane because I run an organization all about democracy and I'm absolutely grown adult who's very, very keyed in. But I pushed through and made sure that my vote counted, and I think that's really important. But voter suppression happens in a number of forms. It can be intimidation, it can be violence, it can be long lines, or we see all types of ways that people are, especially during COVID, there were all types of ways that voter suppression happened. In my organization, we saw in Wisconsin, young people with health issues who were really forced because they never received their vote by mail ballot to go in person and risk their lives to vote. This is a form of voter suppression when you don't manage to get your ballot, vote by mail ballot that you applied for, things like this. Gerrymandering is a huge issue. A lot of people don't know that in about half the states in the US, the legislature is in charge of drawing the lines and where people vote. When I was at Spelman, I was told that there would never again be a Black city because gerrymandering, this partisan drawing of lines and maps, would really dissipate the power of the Black vote and the power of Democrats in certain regions. And they would redraw the line so that that power would be dissipated. If the legislature is drawing the maps and the governors are approving, certainly you need to be very mindful of who you're voting into those spaces and if you show up and the power of your vote. We saw a lot of disinformation happen during this last election. People were getting calls and emails and text messages, giving them incorrect dates, incorrect information about where to show up, incorrect information about how they could vote. And this is a really, really big deal, especially in the days of Google. What information can you get? Who can you trust? Where do you find out about who's going to be on the ballot? Where do you find out about how you vote? All of this stuff really amounts to voting barriers, particularly for young people and particularly for people of color. And then we find these really arcane voting laws all over the United States. That's one thing that my organization, we fight. We've seen voting laws that criminalize issues in Tennessee around voter ID. We saw a ban on on-campus polling sites or voting sites in Florida. We saw crazy arcane voting ID laws in Alabama this past year. There's just all across the country, we saw all types of issues. And what we know is that when young people show out and when people of color show out in the ways that they did, the result in 2021, we've already seen a number of proposed voting laws that will make it harder and harder and harder for people to vote. Because of COVID, initially, when people were locking down and quarantining, there was a lot of issue about college students and whether college students could vote in the jurisdiction where their school was or whether they could vote when they went home. All of this stuff greatly affects young people. What type of ID you can bring? Can you bring a school ID? Do you need a state ID? We experienced all of that as an organization. We made sure to get out good information to people so they knew where to vote, how to vote, and if they could vote with certain IDs. But it's really important to pay attention now as a young person because all of these crazy laws are showing up that are going to really work hard to make sure that your voice and vote is not counted in the next elections and to suppress your vote. So you have to pay attention and you have to stand up. Voting, I will make sure that I always go on record, is not the only solution. And I really know that people get mad when people say, okay, we'll vote and you'll be good. Just vote and racism will go away. No, there's no way. But we have to vote. And I'm a student of history and really look at movements and systems change. And over the course of history in the US and South Africa, all over the world, you see that there is hard power and soft power. And so when people have used one form of demanding change, peaceful protests, voting, all these other things, it's always and often been complemented by a shout, a demand, something loud, taking to the streets, demanding change. And I would argue that young people, the Gen Zers, the young millennials, were so powerful last year in 2020 and taking the streets in your mass, demanding change. That scared people. That scared corporations to start making all of these inclusive messages. It scared people who were elected to start using language that we've never seen that was more inclusive and was concerned about people of color. We have to demand, we have to argue. People in my generation have become very cynical about how much change can happen. And we've been used to racism and sexism and all homophobia in our workplaces. But it's the Gen Zers who say, no, not in my workplace. No, not in my school. I see that, I don't like it. I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna write a letter. I'm gonna call the media. I'm gonna put together a protest. I'm gonna shake this up. We will not get anywhere unless we demand change. We cannot be okay with the status quo anymore. We've been going through this for years and things have really remained pretty much the same until recently. A lot of the big movements that we're seeing have come because people are disgusted. But it is also true that when you see an outcry, like we saw in Georgia, flipping Georgia from red to blue, then you see what we saw on January 6th with people saying, don't count that, that didn't count. We're gonna take to the Capitol, we're gonna storm the Capitol, we're gonna actually inflict terror on our Capitol because we don't want young people and people of color's votes to count. Let's in fact find other votes because we don't want that to matter. So all of this means you have to stay educated, you have to pay attention to what's going on, you have to vote, you have to take to the streets, you have to demand. It's a very holistic approach to fighting racism. But I wanna open the floor. And certainly I don't wanna step outside of the agenda for today, but I want to hear from y'all about what you're seeing in your communities, what types of ways you've demanded systems change, what has been effective, what are some of the challenges, and I'd love for this to be a conversation around us thought partnering solutions to racism in America. Thank you.
Alex, thanks so much for a magnificent presentation, Alex. We learned a lot and we were inspired. I was inspired even by the young you down on Spelman's campus helping to change things so that they're better today. We've gotten a number of questions. Our backs are up against the time wall, but we're going to take time because this is important conversation. Let me throw right at you, Alex, right now. One of the things that we've seen is people get to the place where they feel like this is another rerun season of the same thing over and over again. In 1983, Philadelphia elected Wilson Goode mayor. Around the same time, Chicago elected Harold Washington mayor. In 1989, David Dinkins. We all thought things were going to change. And it was that youthful exuberance. Wilson Goode was 48 years old back in 1983. He's in his 80s right now. How do we make changes? How do we institutionalize the energy and demands that young people are making so that we don't find ourselves right back here again with Groundhog Day every day?
That's a great question. I'm really, really of the thought that we're not going to see change through any one charismatic leader. And I think that often is what people are hoping for. Just get rid of Trump and Biden will save the day. And I know that young people are really disgusted by that message. But I do think that young people really have the answers. I think that what we're seeing on our college campuses and what we're seeing across the country is that young people really are the most inclusive. They are the most tolerant. They understand how to get along largely, but it's old people who keep inflicting these ideas of, racism, misogyny, all these other things that we're seeing. But young people are still kind of trying to find their way up. They're not the ones hiring people. They're not the ones making these policies and laws, but we have to let go of some of the reins. And I'm saying I'm not that old. But as the older generation, I think we need to put more young people into the conversation and we'll see a lot more change.
So Alex, one of the things we've seen in voting demographics from 2020's race is for Trump voters, the most highly energized voting group among Trump voters were 21 to 28.
Right.
And so while we're seeing one group become very inclusive, increasingly inclusive, less concerned about things like gender and orientation, we're also seeing, not so much the inclusive nature of this younger group, but maybe we're seeing a wide chasm of division. And how do we, and this is a question I'm going to throw to you and then to Chip second, how do we get the white folks who are pretty poor in Wilkes-Barre, who have underfunded school districts, to understand they're in exactly the same boat as underfunded schools in West Philadelphia that are walking distance to Lower Merion High School?
Yeah, that's great. What we've said in our organization is what the young people wanted, we saw. And it's exactly as you said. So in certain districts and states, the young people kind of, whatever they wanted, that was who kind of came into power in that state or who got the votes. But a lot of what I've seen among young people is still a lack of exposure. And so on college campuses, a lot of times people are meeting their first first Black person, first whatever. But we still have very segregated country, and we still have a country where people are not getting exposed to different types of people. And in those places, we're seeing a lot of ignorance is continuing to fester. And in those places, we're seeing people voting against their interests, particularly as it relates to economics, socioeconomics. What I'm really hoping we can do as a country to heal and to begin to heal is to have these really honest conversations. When I'm hearing young people, particularly young white people, talk about the history of this country, they're missing huge parts about enslavement, a lot of the stuff that Professor Gallagher talked about. And they're saying, well, why do we need reparations? You know, I didn't do anything. I'm not racist. So what's the problem? Why do we need any of this stuff? And it's because they don't know what's happened in this country. And we haven't had a lot of these conversations as a country. And people ask me, well, why don't we talk about race in America? Why don't we talk about enslavement? And it's because America has this big feeling of shame and embarrassment. And until America takes responsibility for its atrocities against its own people, the Tulsa bombing in 1921, internment camps, all of this stuff, until we have honest conversations and we see the fruit of that in our education systems, then people are going to continue to be ignorant about why this matters. Because I hear people say all the time, can we just move on? Why are we still talking about that? Because for every reason that Professor Gallagher talked about, it's showing up in everything. It permeates every part of American life. And until we start to have those healing conversations, we're going to continue to see people angry and divided.
Professor Gallagher, I'm throwing it right to you again.
Yeah,
How do we get the kids who are at Wilkes-Barre High School, who view themselves as patriotic, loyal Americans and support the blue and black and back the blue? How do we get them to understand that they're almost in exactly the same economic predicament globally that poor Black kids are in West Philly?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think Alex got to a lot of it. I think it's actually worse in some ways than she's saying. I mean, I think that a lot of young people, it's very bifurcated. I have two young, 19, 22. They don't like Biden at all. They are way left of Biden. Biden was like, they're voting for a generation that was kind of locked, which I don't necessarily agree with completely, but I do understand from Bernie what they wanted. And I understand that this population, but I would suggest that the people that you're talking about, the people in Wilkesboro, it's way worse because they don't even want to talk about race because racism is over. And this is the kind of work I do on color blindness. They have bought into the argument that race isn't the reason why people are successful or not. It is fundamentally character traits. It's you're not working hard enough. So that's the kind of baseline that people are starting from. So, and when I mean it's worse than that, not only do they believe that the playing field is now level, the reality is that Black folks and brown folks are taking things away from them. It's a zero-sum game mentality. Immigrants took our job. Black people took our jobs. They're using our social resources. This is the narrative that the right has been very successful in publishing everywhere, from radio stations to, I mean, there's a reason there's a rise right now in hate groups. Neo-nationalism, white nationalism is alive and well in the United States in ways it hasn't been for 30 or 40 years. And you know, Alex said it right. It's like you're voting against your own interests. And so how do we do it? I think the way you do it is you get to see, I think Georgia is a good example of the last Senate round that just happened with Kelly Loeffler, who was just not a good person as I saw her. And the way that part of what the, and again, the majority of white people did not vote for who won, Warnock, but he was able to present it as a way that I'm appealing to everyone. And it was around stimulus checks. The idea is that we're all in this together. How do you create a narrative where we can expand the pie? I'm not taking away from you. We're going to grow together. And I think that has to be communicated. And the Democratic Party's been horrible at that.
Chip, let's stay with you for a second. And one of the challenges that we see right now is it's you've got to choose one or the other. So that if you're going to celebrate America, if you're going to celebrate what the Museum of the American Revolution represents, our founding fathers, obviously fraught with shortcomings, because we saw what happened to how they defined Black people's participation in democratic space as 3/5 and for purposes of taxation and representation. How do we then take this strange balance and celebrate America and also ask America to become a more perfect union at the same time by pushing and prodding her to be great?
Right, and I think this is back to something that Alex said. I think that, you know, I think that white America, there needs to be a reckoning. And, you know, like the line like, oh, I didn't own slaves, I didn't do anything wrong. That's absolutely true, right? I did not do this, but I can tell you what I did get. My father got the GI Bill, right? He was in the Korean War and he got benefits. He got benefits of getting a row house in Philadelphia, nonetheless, college education, a master's degree in history, high school teacher. That wasn't available to people. And that set basically my family, again, very modest means, but set us in motion to become lower middle class and then becoming middle class. I think that what we need to be able to do is to communicate to white American, like, we're not calling you a racist, but you have to understand what happened. Philadelphia is a good example. Philadelphia monopolized all the civil servant jobs. I grew up with Rizzo, right? There were no black cops, although Rizzo was responsible for bringing black cops into the fold. This city was segregated occupationally, right? The idea is that good jobs were monopolized by white people, and that was all over. Remember, I was in Atlanta for 12 years. I mean, I saw the vestiges of what it meant to basically for white folks to monopolize all the good jobs and what it means 2-3 generations later. So we need to have a narrative where white folks understand that, yeah, there has been privilege. No one is pointing a finger at you per se, but there is a reality of American history, and it's painful to learn it. I mean, I interview white people all over the country, and they don't want to hear ever that they're privileged. And so how do you have a conversation about racial equity, racial equality, when a lot of people don't even want to think about the reality is that you got to where you were, or your dad or mom did, because of things that benefited you when you were in a union. There were no black folks in union in Philadelphia in the 40s. They were off limits, right? And that set a lot of folks up. So it's a tall order, Pastor, about how do we get people to believe the best way we all grow together is by expanding the pie. And I think in this world, I mean, I think it's been very smart politically, is you devolve the government, you give the government less things to do. We're not funding the federal government the same way. Harrisburg isn't funding Philadelphia. So people are scraping for the crumbs. And that becomes a way to pit one group against another. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done.
Alex, you went to school in Atlanta. Atlanta is a totally different place, as Chip just alluded to. It's a city that Maynard Jackson and Jesse Hill and others made sure that there was significant Black wealth there. Do you view, yes or no, and either way, if you just take a few minutes with it, do you view the economic development that happened in Atlanta with Atlanta's Black business sector as a way to help to push social justice agendas?
Yes and no. So like most HBCUs, Spelman's campus used to be in a very stressed socioeconomic neighborhood. And the gentrification wasn't just white people, it was like wealthier Black people. And I remember watching people being displaced, Section 8 housing being just eradicated so they could put it in these luxury apartments. And that's a social justice issue, and that affects people in a number of ways. And we saw people being given one-way bus tickets and say, good luck relocating. So certainly there's a lot of benefit to improving Black business ownership and allowing a little bit of a equalization and allowing a wider access to the pot. But what you see in Atlanta is still such a large disparity between middle class and upper middle class Blacks and Blacks that are still really struggling, and a lot of social justice issues that still continue to rack that city.
So go ahead, Chip.
Just quick, I remember reading the obituary for Maynard Jackson, and he said he is responsible for creating more Black millionaires than anyone in American history. And I was really intrigued by that. I was living in Atlanta at the time. And the reason for that was that as mayor, he got his finger on government contracts. And the wealth of our nation, you look at people that get the contract for 95 or to build a 5th runway at an airport, right? If your family gets that, you are set. And then you hire your own people. This is historically what Daley did in Chicago, what Rizzo did here. When you're mayor, you basically it's the pork, right? One person's pork is another person's prosciutto, but you give to your constituents basically the contracts got you there. And that's empowerment. And I thought this is American history, right? But it took hundreds of years for certain groups to become mayors. I mean, look at the ascension of Italians in New York City. It wasn't that long. And that's about being white. The Irish, a good example. It wasn't very long. The Irish were here before they were running the show, right? So their race played off for them. But this is the kind of thing is that one has to understand about how people became middle class. A lot of this was rigged. And it was rigged for some groups more than others. And this is the problem, is that we find ourselves here now and people look back and say, well, you all worked really hard. Like, well, yeah, of course you worked hard, but also your path was greased, right, by these kinds of policies that were in place. And again, this is like getting back to how do you expand the pie now in times of austerity? This is the real problem. How do we do this now? How do we basically bring people up? You know, what's the idea of a rising tide raising all ships? It's kind of hard to get that tide going right now.
How I'm going to push you even a little bit further on that, Chip. How, because now we're in an age where policies and laws have changed. The court has chimed in on Richmond v. Croson and other things. So it's harder to distribute pork. So the pork farms are a lot smaller than they were when Fiorello LaGuardia became mayor of New York City and when Wilson Goode became mayor of the city of Philadelphia. How do we get to the place where the changes that Alex and younger people are talking about become institutionalized? Do they just have to wait until they get gray hair and beards like the two of us and receding hairlines? How do they do it faster?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's unfortunately, just looking at where we're going, we have a shrinking middle class. We have growing poor population. We have a shrinking middle class. You know, and people don't want to talk about this, but the monies that were available that made a middle class were through taxation, right? You know, after your first 5 million, you got taxed at a higher rate. Where did that money go? It went into schools. It went into rec centers, right? It went into basically, look at the cost now of Penn State versus where it was 30 years ago. And the reason is that at the state level, the federal level, they're not paying as much, right? So these money, it was called taxes. You know, people want to say tax the rich, but that's what it came to. You start with Reagan and you move forward. You look at where the monies went. They didn't go to middle of America. There was no trickle down. It went up. And that money is no longer available basically to invest in lower middle class families, to invest in cities. We're divesting in our cities. Aside from the gentrification bubbles in Philadelphia, Fishtown, Port Richmond, you know, Bella Vista, we're not investing in our city. And this is the kind of thing, and the reason is the money isn't there. So Philadelphia and Harrisburg are fighting against each other. And who suffers? Our schools suffer. So, you know, again, how do we get money to the coffers? I mean, no one wants to hear about it, but you start taxing, and I mean, not the 1%, because it's what, $460,000 into 1%. I'm talking about the 1/10 of 1%. People that are making $10 or $12 million a year, they're taxed at a lower rate than they've ever been taxed before in American history. So, I mean, again, it's unpopular, but you know, it's certainly, I think it's if you want the privilege of having a infrastructure like the America, then pay for it. You basically pay. Your employees went to public schools and you're making $50 million a year, you should be paying your fair share. But that's a very unpopular kind of political platform to be on.
Questions from the audience in the chat session. Wade Katz says, perhaps one way to address job training, affordable housing, gainful employment through Philadelphia community colleges and/or high school vocational schools. Develop preservation trades program teaching skilled carpentry, masonry, construction trades for rehabbing and reusing the immense historical building stock in the city. Such training can lead to good paying jobs, gainful and meaningful employment, personal and financial investment in communities, and a path forward for affordable housing. This will require support and buy-in from City Hall, real estate, development industry, but also can be a great way to deal with issues of climate change and jobs. Absolutely. Not sure where the question is in that, but couldn't agree any more with it. Either of you like to chime in on those points? I'm trying to keep you all engaged, look at screens, and answer things from the chat session as well. So
multitasking. You know, the only thing I would add is just something that was mentioned about K-12 education. You know, so I founded a school substance in Brooklyn. And I think one thing that people don't realize is that failing schools have a lot of money. You know, they get a lot of money. So I think this idea is that, you know, we need to get more money into these schools. I think people would be surprised at how money is allocated into K-12 schools, whether charter or standard public. The issue really is about who the leaders are, boards of education. Things are not, you know, the standard of education, the curricula, all of these pieces really go into it. Teachers unions, which have a lot of power. It's very complicated. And this idea that we'll just have better schools a lot of the institutions of racism are affecting everything, including housing, jobs, whether parents can be involved or not. It's not just as simple as saying we need more money in schools.
And with respect, do you think that this COVID experience has been a reckoning moment? Everybody keeps saying this is the reckoning, this is the reckoning. People thought 2008 was the reckoning. Then the election of Obama later that year was the reckoning. What's different about these times? Is this it?
I think it's a magnifying glass. What COVID showed us is how these disparities are really affecting communities of color. From the fact that, Black people couldn't get time off work, didn't have, proper health care. The fact that there were issues about childcare. The fact that there were disparities in technology. It just illuminated all of these bigger problems, the disparate health outcomes for people of color. It really put a magnifying glass on our criminal justice system. I don't know if it's a reckoning, Lord knows, I feel like we're gonna have another reckoning this year, but it definitely showed that all the things that we said were not possible, many of those things were possible, and that there were also much larger issues than that anyone really had been talking about previously.
I am just about finished my extremely challenging multitasking of making sure I try to stay in the frame, ask meaningful questions to remarkably caring, compassionate, and brilliant people. I think they have done a magnificent job. It draws attention again to the long-term benefit of having an institution like the Dennis family and the Dennis farm, posing these challenging questions and not simply living in the past the way many museums do and land trusts do, but actually living in real time. It is a worthwhile institution that deserves your support and attention. My father bought a synagogue back in 1982, and I can remember I was 12 years old, and above the main entrance door, there was something that said, "Teach thy children." The Dennis farm and its land trust will be as relevant as our teaching is of our children and grandchildren. And it is the product of a multi-generational family that took inventory of its assets and figured out it wanted to continue to play a role in the world the same way their family did in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and through the major arcs and sweeps of this country. I think my work is just about done. I know we've gone over time, but the culprit is not the Black Baptist preacher who preached too long and kept everybody in. It was the Catholic kid from LaSalle, and it might have been the Baptist lady from Storrs, Connecticut, but they are the ones who did it. This is the 4th Annual Lonaé A Memorial Forum. Its theme, "It Begins With Us," fostering racial understanding, is a great way to tie into the living legacy of a young lady who went on to glory way too early, but she left us with a blueprint on how to be substantial. This was presented by the Dennis Farm Charitable Trust. Please, as that slide goes right back, donate to the Farmhouse Museum. I'm gonna write my check, or I'll do it online to donate, the dennisfarm.org, or mail your check. We still take checks. That address moved too quickly. I can see the folks operating this are not part of the Baptist tradition. You never move too fast when you are appealing for money. The Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, P.O. Box 2583, Bala, Kenwood, Pennsylvania, 19004. We need your help. We need your support. And America needs to have this woven into its DNA so that it does not ever forget exactly who the Dennis family was and how they have been side by side with us as we've gone through this great sojourn. I want to personally thank Alex and Chip for doing a magnificent job. We'll probably be calling on you all again in the future, and we'll make sure that all of this goes up online so that people are able to benefit from having not been here. That's the beauty of COVID. Everything is virtual and it lasts longer. If our producers will take over.